Thank you, Hannah Lester, for coming on to the Future of Foods interview. We did meet at the Future of Food Technology Summit in London about a month or 6 weeks ago. And you very kindly agreed to come on the program, the show. So you are quite a prominent figure in the novel food regulation space. You are head of regulation at Gourmet, and you also run your own regulatory consultancy company. So Gourmet have just filed for novel food approval in the EU. So how was that? How was that process in the EU with EFSA?
Very good question. I mean, obviously, it's a lot more, there's a lot of planning involved. So I would say overall, the whole process from start to finish took around, I don't know, around 18 months from starting with the gap analysis and regulatory roadmap through to executing the analyses on the regulatory batches, building out the dossier, performing all the literature searches. And then submitting the dossier itself, dealing with all the specific nuances of the EFSA guidance documents and the uploading of documentation to the e-submission food chain platform, having to redact and sanitize documents for the confidential and non-confidential versions. So yes, it's a lot of work, but we're really delighted to have the first dossier submitted to the European Commission. And the good news is the European Commission has validated the dossier, and now they forwarded it to the European Food Safety Authority. So EFSA is now doing their suitability check, and hopefully we will be under EFSA risk assessment, Q1 next year, which will be very, very exciting.
Okay, so it sounds like they are working in quite a streamlined way then on this first application. Is that the impression you get?
I think, well, I don't think I know. We were very fortunate to have a member of the novel foods team attend our Regulating the Future of Food conference in Amsterdam on the 23rd and 24th of October. And the representative that was there speaking at our conference said that, they're really excited about cultivated meat and they're looking forward to reviewing this first dossier.
Hmm.
Um, he Wolfgang also said on stage that he had heard it's a very good dossier, so that's very encouraging.
Yeah.
And yes, I believe EFSA's really excited about this, but more importantly, we were very happy that we got the feedback from the European Commission so quickly. They basically are saying, yes, this is a novel food. And so it's a very clear mandate to EFSA that they are to perform the risk assessment under the novel food framework. And, in light of, many member states, saying that the novel food regulation isn't fit for purpose. Cultivated meat should be evaluated under more stringent rules akin to, pharmaceuticals. I think this is a win for the industry that the European Commission is saying yes, it's in scope of the novel food regulation, and
Okay.
on to EFSA for them to perform their very thorough risk assessment.
Okay, well that is good news. Do you think Europe might now have the potential to be a driver of this industry? Do you think it's changed as a result of the new administration in the USA?
Oof.
It's a big question, I know. Yes.
That I am confident, the European Commission is doing their part. They're sticking to the fact that cultivated meat is in scope of the novel food regulation. We know that EFSA is going to do their very thorough independent scientific risk assessment on cultivated meat. And then So I'm very confident about that part, so the risk assessment part. But obviously in the EU, we have the risk management part where it goes to the member states to be voted on whether or not to approve the novel food at the PAF committee. And what we need in order to get a novel food approved is 55% of the member states representing 65% of the EU population to vote in favor. And, we already know that there's several large countries in the EU that are likely to vote against. So this is going to be the problematic part. But in terms of getting a fair risk assessment, absolutely, in Europe, I think it's the place to go. But I think also on the risk management side, there is a lot of work to do for companies and trade associations to really engage with the member states and to help them understand what cultivated meat is and what it isn't. To really sort of get them on side and get them to vote in favor. But it's very difficult because we're not talking about GMOs, we're talking about novel food. There's not the same mechanisms for member states to veto, approving novel foods.
Right.
And the European Commission is always going to try and get the member states to a qualified majority if there's no safety concerns or issues with the novel food itself.
Okay. All right. Well, I thought I'd start with the hard questions so we can we can move on to something a little less testing. So what are the key steps involved in the process then? I mean, I read a piece that you wrote recently about pre-submission advice. I assume this comes right at the beginning.
Yes, I mean, I would always start with performing a regulatory feasibility assessment. So, checking out the regulatory feasibility of your ingredient, checking which regulatory pathway it fits under. So whether or not it's a novel food or a food additive or something else, whether it's indeed novel at all, and whether you even need to go through the whole pre-market authorization process. And then also looking at, other key factors like whether or not there are any regulatory red flags within your proposed novel food or food ingredient. So thinking about things like, cell lines used for the production of cultivated meat, where they come from, what kind of traceability you have. And then if we're talking about microbially derived foods, does the production organism have a safe use of history of use in food already? Those kind of considerations, because then it helps you, to really understand the regulatory feasibility and infer, things about costs and timelines as well to market, and also, the probability of regulatory success. So that's, where I always start. And then when we know a little bit more about the ingredient and the production process, and we have more information available, especially things like a rough idea of what your production process is, what the culture medium or fermentation medium is going to be, then that's a good point to perform your gap analysis and prepare your regulatory roadmap, which is a much more in-depth analysis of your ingredient and all of the steps, all of the data, all of the studies that you need to generate in order to support the safety and identity of your food ingredient, along with the strategy. And you have, at that point, a much better understanding of how much it's going to cost you and how long it's going to take to build out your dossier, perform all the studies, and get that dossier submitted. And I think after that gap analysis stage, when you have a much more robust strategy, that's the point at which you should engage with the regulators, because you can't expect regulatory authorities to do the hard work for you. You need to go to them with something that they can assess.
Mm,
So, you can't just say, I've got this, this food and, what should I do?
mm,
No, you need to go to them saying, this is my ingredient. We understand the regulatory framework. We believe that this is the data set that is required. Do you agree? And then you can have a discussion, and then they'll provide feedback. But, certainly going in and expecting them to do the hard work for you is not going to fly.
right. Okay. I mean, I suspect you're pretty busy at the moment, are you, with kind of various applications? Have you experienced that where you've had to sort of go in once they've sort of started the process too quickly and then got a bit sort of confused?
Um, No, I don't think so. Not from personal experience. I mean, there's a lot of pre-planning that goes on before getting to the point of submitting a dossier. And we do have, not in all cases, but in most cases, we have guidance documents and also precedents that we can learn from. So I think we prepare these gap analyses and these regulatory plans. And also particularly with startups, things change, they evolve all the time. So,
Mm,
you don't have a fixed target. It's moving all the time. Production processes are being iterated and changed. Different parts are being tweaked. So, you're learning with the company as you go.
yes.
And, I think that's also a good opportunity as well to engage with regulators pre-submission, but also you shouldn't push too hard. You shouldn't, be a pest and go to them every, 5 minutes with these small questions. So it's really finding a balance.
Yes, I mean, I used to work for Ofcom back in the old days, so I understand how kind of regulators work. That it's about sort of building a relationship, and if you can actually find an individual that's on your side, you can move mountains. But if you upset people, then
Yes.
you are never going to hear from them again, probably. So have you dealt with a number of jurisdictions around the world? Have you been in Asia and America and various places?
Yeah, we've worked on applications and dossiers in US, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, um, now UK. We're doing a lot of work in GB. So yes, we've written a lot of dossiers for a lot of
Okay.
different regions.
And which of them have you found the most streamlined so far?
You mean in terms of, interaction and submission of dossier and review of
Yeah, I mean,
dossier?
I would probably imagine that sort of Singapore, because they've been through the process a few times already, that they kind of know what they're doing sort of better than some others that are just starting out.
I mean, if we're talking about cultivated meat and seafood specifically, then I think all of the regulatory agencies are still learning. And so, even though Singapore's already evaluated a couple of dossiers and the FDA have evaluated a couple of dossiers, their understanding and of the process and the risks is evolving as well. So, we're learning together, I would say, on what is required in order to support the safety of cultivated meat and seafood. In terms of streamlined, I mean, they all have slightly different approaches, I would say. So in the US and Singapore, it's possible to have pre-submission meetings where you present your regulatory strategy and they'll provide feedback. which is incredibly helpful. Whereas in the EU, EFSA gives general pre-submission advice, but it is very general. I mean, it's the scope that they've been mandated. It's in the legislation, so it's not that EFSA, doesn't want to give more meaningful advice. It's just, what they're being told to do by the legislation. And I think that is very frustrating for applicants and causes it to be less streamlined because you have to interpret the guidance, the updated guidance now, which actually does include more provisions for cultivated meat and seafood. And we don't have any precedents in the EU for applicants to really follow. So we're making our best guess, and you don't know until you submit the dossier if it hits the mark for EFSA.
Right.
And that's very frustrating because you've invested time and money in performing these studies, and then you submit, then you have the feedback, and then you might have to go back and do additional studies or redo studies. So yes, I think that is a big frustration, and that is why it's less streamlined, I would say, because you have to really guess what they want to see before you
Right.
submit your dossier.
And have EFSA given you any idea of how long it would take then from start to finish?
Well, they have 9 months to perform the risk assessment. So that's a legal timeline set in the legislation. So they have 9 months, but they can stop the clock at any point and request additional information from the applicant. So that 9 months just can get extended and extended.
Okay.
But it's not, this is not all EFSA's fault. It's also down to the applicant to provide a very good quality dossier, good quality data, following the guidance as much as possible, and also responding quickly to clock stops. So, I think applicants can be very taken aback when they receive these letters from EFSA. And you can run around, in circles thinking, oh my God, how am I going to respond to this? So I think, as well, you need to respond quickly. You need to have a strategy in place about how you're going to respond to these clock stops and get the response submitted as soon as possible, because then the clock starts again.
Okay. So are you working on your own with the in the consultancy, or do you have help? Because it sounds like an awful lot of work.
Oh yes, I have a lot of help.
Right.
I wouldn't be able to do it all by myself. So yeah, we've got a team of 8 people. So
Hmm.
there's 8 of us at Atova. We're all scientists, so we don't have legal background, but we've all been working in regulatory affairs for many, many years now, and working a lot on many different regulated product applications. So I think all of the team originally started working on animal feed additives, and then we slowly got into novel foods. So novel foods is now our main focus.
Yeah, so I remember you telling me you started out as a vet. Is that right?
Yes, it was. I started out life working on veterinary medicine development. So that was my first job was working on anti-parasitic drugs for mainly livestock animals, and then and doing the sort of regulatory side of that, and then getting into many, many years later, through a very convoluted route, getting into animal feed additives and then novel foods. So yeah,
Okay, yeah.
I don't think anyone sets out to be a regulatory affairs person. It's not what you dream of when you're 4 years old, but
No,
everyone
no.
that's in it, you just fall into it somehow, and then you either love it or hate it.
I suppose it's about loving the industry as much as loving the work and just sort of finding your niche within it, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're all, the team at Atova, we're all really passionate about food tech, and it's challenging from a regulatory perspective, but also a scientific perspective. And yeah, it's just fascinating, and we feel so privileged to work with so many amazing companies that are doing wonderful things. So it really is,
Mm.
yeah, a joy.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that you've started working with the FSA in the UK on an application. How are you finding that? I know that they've had the dog foods which they gave permission for recently. So I'm assuming that you are. I'm not going to ask who it is or what it's for, but it's. I'm assuming it's for human food, is it?
Yeah, so I mean it's publicly known that it's, Gourmet has submitted
Okay.
their dossier to the FSA and FSS, so that's sitting with them at the moment. But it's really exciting. FSA and FSS got the funding for the sandbox for
Mm,
the cell cultured food products, sorry, sandbox. So that's really exciting. And
mm.
I think we will see a lot more happening in that area once the sandbox launches in the spring next year. So at
Okay.
the moment, we haven't heard anything about the gourmet dossier at the moment, and if you none of the cultivated meat dossiers that we know have been submitted. All of these things, the companies are very proud to let the world know when they have submitted a dossier. So, we know that Vital Meat have submitted a dossier, Aleph Farms have submitted a dossier. So, but at the moment, none of the dossiers are showing up in the regulated product register, which is
Right.
sort of the list of all the ongoing regulated product applications.
Mm. I know Aleph Farms, they applied in the UK, Israel, and Switzerland, didn't they? So
Mhm.
Israel approved quite quickly, probably because it's an Israeli company. But have you? Does that imply that the UK's slower than Israel at these things, or is it just because? Yeah, because it's an Israeli company. What do you think?
I know that Israel did have a sandbox actually for cultivated products. So I think I don't know all the details, but I know that there was a sandbox. So I think, that certainly helped move the risk assessment along for Aleph Farms, and also Remilk were included in that as well. So, Remilk got their
Mm.
recombinant beta-lactoglobulin approved as well. So, I think that was because of this sandbox.
Okay.
I think the FSA just have a huge backlog of CBD dossiers that they're trying to wade through. And also, they have limited resources. So I think things are taking quite a long time at the moment in terms
Mm.
of the regulated product risk assessments within FSA, not just for novel foods, but across the board. But again, they're trying to, they recommend
Oh,
you. Ah, sorry, I think you were frozen a little bit then.
I thought you were frozen. Yes, I'm not sure who froze, but
Oh dear.
but we're back.
Um, but yeah, I mean that yeah, the FSA are trying to implement easy wins to speed everything up, which I think is really great. And I'm very hopeful for this sandbox that will, help to move things forward.
Okay.
Cultivated meat.
Okay. So, what do you find when you're putting together your roadmap and your dossier? Which bits do you find um, the most complicated to put together? Is there a section?
I mean, I think we all have parts that we like more than others. I hate the intake assessments and exposure assessments. I hate that. That's always the one I try and hand over to someone else.
Right.
There is a real art to it. And yeah, I mean, I always try and avoid that one. I have colleagues that are much better and much more patient with that section than I am.
Okay.
I think the tox section as well is always tricky, depending on the product you're working with. I mean, if you've got all of the tox studies and the company has gone down that path and done genotoxicity, subchronic toxicity, then it's very easy. You just write it up. But when you're trying to justify why you haven't followed that approach, then that is you're relying then on the literature, and you're trying to build a really good argument and justification as to why you've omitted those studies. But I really enjoy that. I think
Okay.
that's it's a challenge, but it's a good one. I think the others are relatively
I mean, I suppose
straightforward.
a lot of it is or a significant proportion of it is going to be looking at sort of safety for the public, sort of, and
Mhm.
ensuring, but also at the same time, I suppose you can't fixate on that. So, I mean, sort of consumer safety is a top priority, but how do you sort of balance that risk of ensuring public safety and fostering innovation and that sort of thing?
I mean, of course, there's absolutely no compromise on safety. So there's no shortcuts. There's no way to get around the requirements. And that's where it does feel like some of the requirements are blocking innovation. Not the requirements. No, that's not correct. Not the requirements, but the framework, let's say, because not like none of the companies I work with want to cut corners. Safety is their number one priority, and they're committed to making sure that they perform all of the tests and studies necessary to support safety. But I think it's more the framework that's a block or a hindrance to innovation, just because it's taking so long.
Mm,
A novel food authorization in the EU and UK, if you look at the timelines written in the legislation, it should take around 18 months from submission to approval. And most companies, they'll deal on that. That's not a problem if it's predictable. But I think it's the unpredictable nature of the timelines, that's the main frustration. And you think you've done everything according to the guidance, and then there's endless rounds of questions, and then that really just pushes out, the timeline to market. So yeah, it's not about safety, it's the framework.
okay. So what are some of the biggest regulatory hurdles then that they face when they're kind of putting this together? Is it around, I mean, I suppose because people can't sort of taste the food, really, can they, in most situations? It hasn't been trialed, has it?
No, I mean, and that is one of the hurdles. I mean, there are many, if we're just talking about cultivated meat and seafood, there are regulatory challenges, there are technological challenges, and then there's political consumer acceptance challenges as well. So
Mm.
yeah, it's incredibly complex. And from a regulatory perspective, I think that the key challenges are, really understanding what the regulators want to see. Because as I mentioned earlier, the regulators are still learning about cultivated meat and how to perform the risk assessment. So with every dossier they review, they're getting more questions. And I think it's at the moment, it's in that stage of becoming more difficult rather than easier, because the first dossiers that were reviewed, um, not that they got away with things, that's absolutely not what I mean, but it was probably a little bit easier because the the regulators were, learning about it. Now they're learning and they've learned more, and so they're asking more questions, I
Okay.
would say. So yeah, really knowing exactly what the regulator wants to see, because in the US we don't have any guidelines. So the FDA have said they're committed to publishing guidance for industry in 2025. So yeah, that will be very, very welcome, because it's difficult to navigate without a guidance document. Um,
I wonder about the USA, of course. I mean, with the change of administration, I read something in, I think it was Green Queen recently, that was kind of saying that they expect it to slow right down. I spoke to Anthony Chow from Agronomics not long ago, and he and
mhm.
he said something similar, because they've got a few companies going through US regulation, like Blue Nalu and companies like that, and it's hit a bit of a brick wall.
I mean, it's definitely slowed down. I mean, we haven't seen any no questions letters from the FDA since June last year. So, we haven't seen anything come through this year at all. So that's not on the new administration. I think, that again is FDA learning, and having more questions, and uh, yeah. And also FDA has been through a reorganization as well. So I think,
Right.
that was then implemented on the 1st of October. So things should be more clearer now. But it's true. Who knows with the new administration? I mean, we've already seen bans drawn up in states like Florida and Alabama. Um, and so we know what the sort of general feeling is about these very deeply Republican states, what they're already feeling about it. Um, and not to be alarmist or anything, but the CCC pathway in the US is not written in the legislation. It's just this memorandum of understanding. So it's not like the generally recognized as safe pathway that's sort of been enshrined in the legislation for a very, very long time. This CCC pathway is kind of just yes, a memorandum of understanding between the FDA and USDA. So it could be, that just makes it a little bit more vulnerable, let's say.
Right. Okay. So you said earlier about the hurdles, kind of what the political hurdles being one of the three you mentioned. I mean, do you think that's going to get worse or easier? What's your feeling? Like across the board, across the world, do you think that's going to get worse or better?
Yeah, I mean, globally, I don't see it getting worse, because there are a lot of countries that are much more open and supportive of food innovation and food tech. So, Singapore, for example, that they have policies, they're 30 by 30, where they want to be able to domestically produce 30% of their own food or protein supply. So, I think it depends where we're looking. I think I think now we've got a new administration in the US, then that could shake things up even more. In the UK, I think GB is looking like a very uh, interesting market, because we have this sandbox. The government has invested the money into the sandbox, so I think that's a very strong signal. In the EU, it's
Yeah.
going to be tricky, I think. But that, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of work to do for the companies and trade associations to speak to the EU member states, to speak to the farming lobbies, and really tell them what cultivated meat is and what it isn't.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like it's a kind of rocky but interesting future for cultivated meat regulatory approval. I mean, I'd say that, Israel looks like quite a sort of buoyant place for this? And the Middle East, maybe generally, have you seen signs in other places in the Middle East?
I mean, Israel is becoming more closely aligned with the EU food legislation, so that will certainly make it easier for recognition between EU and Israel. And Israel as well, if you have um, authorization for your novel food in two other regions, then you can go for sort of a fast track approval, which I think is interesting. Um, and then the Middle East, so the only, they have Saudi Arabia and UAE, they have a regulatory framework for novel foods established. Um, but the main issue there is halal and being compliant with halal. So that's the only thing that's not 100% clear, I would say. I mean, in Singapore, the halal, I can't think of the actual word, the name of the organization, but they said that cultivated meat has the potential to be halal.
Right.
Um,
I know
but
that.
I think I haven't
I was
heard
gonna,
anything specifically from the Middle East.
okay, I know that in Israel they had somebody say that it
Mm.
was kosher, right?
Yes.
Which I suspect is along the same lines. So if they can get it there, then they can get it in the Middle East, I suspect.
Yeah, I think again, it's to do with the production process and, some of the isolation steps for cell lines could include, some components of animal origin. So yeah, it's really to know
Yeah.
at what point you have to consider the um, where the framework applies.
Yes. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you, Hannah, for coming on the program. I've got one more question to ask you just before you go, just a sort of general one. I mean, um, what excites you most about the future of this industry? I mean, what is there that we should be looking out for, do you think, in this industry? What have you seen that is quite surprising? I mean, who do you think is going to be next? I suppose is a good question. I mean, who are we going to see? I mean, we've been waiting for people like Blue Nalu for ages, haven't we? I mean, I don't. Who do you think might be next to sort of get approval?
Oof. I mean, I think we're more likely to see another approval in Singapore, in the short term. Um, I don't like to name companies, but
No.
I think we'll see something coming out of Singapore again, in the short term. And
Could
then,
that be
I
an?
really
I mean, could that be an Australian company by any chance, or not? No.
I mean, well, we're waiting to hear about Vow's cultivated quail in Australia and New Zealand. So, that dossier is currently under the second round of public consultation. So, hopefully there will be news on that soon. So that will be exciting. In Singapore, I mean, Vow have already got their approval
Yeah.
in Singapore. So my
Mhm.
money would be on, yeah, someone else
Right.
soon, I hope. And then, yeah, I would really hope to see things move in the US again. But I think we need to see how things pan out at the beginning of next year.
And at the moment, it's a race between the EU and the UK for gourmet.
Uh, yes. I mean, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, EFSA seems to be very excited about cultivated meat in general. And, I'm hopeful, that we've done a good job on the dossier. I mean, there's never a case where you have no questions. That is an impossible, uh, that just would never happen.
Yeah.
But we're hoping that we can work with EFSA and get and respond to their questions quickly to get that through as quickly as possible. So I don't know. I'm very hopeful about the EU. I think I'm optimistic.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Hannah. It's been very lovely to have you on the program, and I'm sure we'll stay in touch. And if you have any more interesting news to share, then perhaps we'll get you on the program again in the future.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.